I've admitted all members of public and individuals waiting in our lobby. I've also commenced recording.
Thank you, Santiago. And with that, good morning. This meeting of the Agricultural Labor Relations Board is called to order. Please note that all meeting participants and members of the public will need to select the language that they prefer to listen to the entire meeting. Even if you can hear me now, please make sure to select your language. You can do that by looking at the bottom of your screen, and on the right-hand side, you will see a button marked Interpretation. Please click on that and you can select your preferred language, either English or Spanish, and you will be able to hear audio at a higher quality level throughout the meeting. I will give a minute for the interpreter to relay this information.
The interpreter has completed her interpretation.
Thank you, Santiago. Next, I will turn to the roll. Board Member Broad?
Here.
Board Member Flores?
Present.
Board Member Hall? We'll come back to Board Member Hall. Board Member Lightstone?
Here.
Thank you. Also present from our staff for today's meeting are our Executive Secretary, Mr. Santiago Avila Gomez, and our Assistant to the Chair, Ed Haas, who is providing technical support. As we all know, we are living in rapidly changing times, and the board is committed to taking the steps necessary to protect the health and safety of not only our staff, but of the public. In accordance with the executive order of Governor Newsom, today's meeting is being held via video conference with an option for members of the public to dial in. We'll first have the business portion of the meeting, which we anticipate will be roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll recess for approximately 10 or 15 minutes and reconvene at 11 a.m. for an informational panel, which is an overview of extreme heat and the impact of heat on the agricultural industry and farm workers. At the close of the business portion of the meeting, we will open it up for public comment on any portion of the meeting. Members of the public who have contacted the board, either by email or phone, and asked to be placed in the public comment queue, will be called on in order received. If you did not previously contact the board and wish to make a public comment at the end of the meeting, you may do so in one of several ways. You can make a request in the Zoom chat function or raise your hand using that icon in Zoom, or email Santiago Avila Gomez to be placed in the queue for public comment. Please note that we ask that you use the chat feature only to indicate if you wish to make a public comment, and do not make public comments in the chat feature. We will not be using those in the official record of today's meetings. If you wish to speak more than once, please alert staff and have your name placed back in the queue if you are able. If you're having technical difficulties when you are called up, please reach out to us via the Zoom chat function or email, and we will come back to you. We do have limited capabilities for managing participation during the meeting and during the public comment periods. So we're asking everyone who is not speaking to place their phones or Zoom on mute and wait to unmute until you are called to speak. We've also received feedback that sometimes there's some typing in the background. So please, if you are not speaking, make sure you're on mute, particularly if you're using your device to take notes. You can also see these instructions on our agenda, which is posted online at alrb.ca.gov and located under the ALRB homepage under News and Information. Proceeding to our first agenda item, approval of the public meeting minutes from June 8th, 2021. May I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move approval.
Recognize Barry Broad, first on hand. Can I have a second? Member Ralph Lightstone, second. All in favor, say aye.
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 Thank you. Public meeting minutes of June 8th, 2021 are approved. The next item for approval are the regional director meeting minutes from June 8th, 2021. May I have a motion to approve the minutes? Board Member Broad with a motion. Can I have a second? Board Member Flores with the second. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 The regional directors meeting minutes for June 8th, 2021 are approved. Next, we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is the chair report. There are several items to report. On June 23rd, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Cedar Point Nursery versus Hasid. In an opinion authored by Chief Justice Roberts with a 6-3 majority, the court held that the board's access regulation constitutes a per se physical taking and that it was uncompensated taking in violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. As will be detailed further by Todd Ratchin during the litigation report, the court has remanded the case and it is now in the United States Eastern District of California. As we stated upon the issuance of the decision, the board is disappointed in this outcome. Regardless, we still maintain that it is imperative for farm workers to know about their rights under the Agricultural Labor Relations Act in order for them to make a meaningful decision about whether and how to exercise those critical rights. We're committed to developing a process to ensure that workers are informed of those critical rights while also comporting with the court's ruling in this case. I want to take a moment to thank our staff for all of their hard work, my fellow colleagues, board members. So many people worked so hard during this process. The first time we've appeared before the United States Supreme Court in our history. And I also want to thank the many organizations that filed amicus briefs in this case, as well as the AG's office for their excellent representation. While it was not the outcome we wanted, I'm humbled by the excellent work of all of those involved, and we're committed to going forward. Next, I'd like to talk about our strategic planning process. I first raised this in June. The ALRB has not had a strategic plan in over a decade, and I'm thrilled that with the full cooperation and leadership and collaboration of our executive team, that we have started to embark on this process. In June, we started to work with all of our staff statewide in order to get their feedback. It was incredibly important for us that this plan be a staff-led, staff-informed plan, as our staff all over the state are really the ones who know how we are doing on the ground, what we need to do, and how we can improve and innovate. And I'm thrilled to say that for the past month, we've been gathering that feedback. The next step will be to reach out to our external stakeholders. We want to hear from employers, from unions, from the plaintiff and defense bar, from community-based organizations, and of course, from farm workers themselves about how we can improve our processes, how we can better serve the public and be more accessible. There will be information in the coming weeks and months as we work to solicit your feedback. And I know everyone is so busy, but I am hopeful that you will provide that feedback, as it will be invaluable to us as we construct a plan for how to innovate and really be a first-class, state-of-the-art public organization going forward. Going on to leadership announcements, there are many changes in and around the ALRB as well as the labor agency. I am pleased to congratulate Jessica Arciniega, who was appointed to serve as the regional director for the Salinas region. The board is absolutely thrilled to have her serving in this critical role. It's been a pleasure for myself to get to work with Jessica this past year and a half, and I'm excited to continue working with her in her new role. The regional director is a critical position in managing and overseeing the ALRB's operations, and we're very fortunate to have someone of Jessica's caliber, expertise, and vision to serve in this capacity. I speak for the board when I extend our warm congratulations. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thrilled to see what you do. Since our last meeting, Labor Secretary Julie Su has been confirmed as the Deputy Secretary for the U.S. Department of Labor. We are sad to see Secretary Su leave, but excited to share her with the rest of the nation. Secretary Su has championed the rights of workers across all sectors, including farm workers, and was a huge supporter of the ALRB in our work. I had the pleasure to work with her for roughly a decade and learn much from her, and I'm excited to see what she does in her new role. I also want to welcome our new Labor Secretary, Natalie Pulugai, and we're excited to also work with her in this new role, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to meet her. I also want to welcome back Undersecretary Stuart Knox. Stuart has been a great support to all the labor agency departments, boards, and commissions, including the ALRB, and we are thrilled to have him back. I also want to thank all of the labor agency team for all their work and support during this period of transition. Lastly, I want to share that starting in mid-September, I will be taking a temporary leave to care for our first child. I will be going on parental leave. I'm incredibly excited about this new chapter, and am relieved and calmed by the fact that the board will be in excellent hands while I take this brief stay away, and also feel very fortunate that I am able to do this and hope we can provide this for all workers going forward. I have fabulous board members and a strong executive team and wonderful staff, and they will no doubt do great work while I'm away. The acting chair will be Ralph Lightstone. He will be starting to serve in this capacity roughly in mid-September. We will see. And I will be returning in early 2022. And with that, that concludes the chair's report. We will have our next item, which is the executive officer's report on elections, unfair labor practice complaints, and hearings with our executive secretary, Santiago Avila Gomez. Santiago.
Thank you, board chair, members of the board and public. The information I'll be presenting here is available on our website as a link in the meetings tab, along with other reports that will be delivered today. Beginning with election activities, since our last meeting on June 8th of this year, there's been one certification issued. Teamsters Local 1932 was certified as the exclusive bargaining representative of Chikun Olam Agananto, effective June 28th. The election date was June 14th, and the case number is 2021 RC 001 VIS. With respect to complaints, there's been one complaint filed and 3 complaints were withdrawn. The complaint that was filed was in Sweetwood Farm, Inc., doing business as Red Rooster, case number 2020 CE 009 VIS. They do business in Tomatoes in Merced, Fresno, and Santa Clara counties. The 3 complaints that were withdrawn were Satellite Farms LLC, withdrawn on June 16th. Santa Rosa Berry Farms LLC, withdrawn July 28th. And Coast King Packing, which was withdrawn yesterday. Since our last meeting, there have been hearings or administrative law judge decisions issued, and there have not been board decisions, administrative orders, and there are currently no cases pending before the board. That concludes my report. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Santiago. Appreciate it. Our next agenda item is agenda item number 5, the litigation report with Chief Board Counsel Todd Ratchin. Todd.
Thank you. Good morning. I've submitted a report to the board with updates in litigation matters involving the board since the last public meeting in June. That is available on our website. Picking up on what you referenced earlier, the most notable item is the Supreme Court's opinion in the Cedar Point litigation in late June. On July 26th, the Supreme Court formally remanded the case to the 9th Circuit. The district court that same day issued an order directing the parties to file status reports by August 9th, and the parties filed a joint status report on August 6th, last Friday. And that is the current status of that litigation back in the district court.
Thank you, Todd. Do any of my colleagues have any questions? Any members of the public? Okay, next is item number 6, the General Counsel's report with General Counsel Julie Montgomery. Julie.
Good morning, everyone, board members and everyone who's present. It's nice to see all your faces. I want to begin by extending a warm welcome and congratulations to our new regional director of the Salinas region, Jessica Arciniega. Jessica assumed this new role at the end of June. And prior to that, she has worked in our Oxnard office for more than 8 years. And she's done some fantastic work both statewide and in that community in Ventura County. And prior to coming to the ALRB, Jessica worked for a private employment law firm and also as a union organizer. So she brings a wealth of experience and much enthusiasm to her role. And I'm really looking forward to working with Jessica in this new capacity. I also want to let people know that we have a number of vacant positions in our regional offices in the general counsel program. We have filled our positions that we had in our, for the statewide positions, the headquarters office, but we do have some positions in Oxnard and Visalia and Salinas for attorneys, as well as a field examiner and staff services analyst position in the Salinas office. So please spread the word. You can direct people to our website if you know of any interested candidates. So during my report, I typically highlight settlements that we have achieved. These are settlements this month that we achieved prior to any hearings. So they are not or were not included in the executive secretary's report. So I just want to highlight some of the great work that our regions have been undertaking. The first settlement is involved a farm worker who was working in pistachio and almond orchards in Kern County, who filed a charge against Wonderful Nurseries and alleged that they fired him because he complained on behalf of his coworkers that they didn't have enough water in the fields and that the water jugs were dirty. The company entered into a pre-complaint settlement with the ALRB for back pay and payment to the worker in lieu of reinstatement. And that was in the amount of $11,015. And they also agreed to our standard remedies of noticing and posting. We also achieved a settlement for a farm worker working in almond orchards in Madera County, who filed a charge alleging that Braden Farms violated the Agricultural Labor Relations Act when it fired him for raising concerns about the foreman on behalf of his coworkers. The ALRB investigated and actually filed a complaint in that matter, as it did find evidence to support the allegations. And the company settled with the ALRB prior to hearing for back pay and payment in lieu of reinstatement to the worker in the amount of $11,500, as well as the standard noticing, reading, and posting remedies. We also achieved a settlement for a farm worker in citrus orchards. A lot of orchard workers got settlements this past period in Riverside County. And this worker had filed a charge alleging that Gless Ranch violated the Agricultural Labor Relations Act when it fired him for raising concerns about the company's piece rate on behalf of coworkers. And in that case, the company entered into a pre-complaint settlement with the ALRB for back pay and also payment in lieu of reinstatement for not payment in lieu of reinstatement. I think it's just back pay but in any event, it was for $511, as well as the remedies of noticing and posting. And a female farm worker performing thinning and weeding work for a vegetable grower in Monterey County filed a charge alleging that FMG Farm Labor Contractor and Merrill Farm LLC violated the Agricultural Labor Relations Act when these companies retaliated against her by issuing a disciplinary ticket because she complained on behalf of herself and others about working conditions and because of perceived participation in support of a then pending ALRB investigation. The employer and the ALRB in that case entered into an informal settlement agreement, and the employer agreed to rescind and expunge the disciplinary ticket from the employee's personnel file and also allow ALRB agents to read the notice to the agricultural employees working in affected crews and to allow the posting and usual remedies and access to the ALRB, of course, for purposes of compliance as in our other cases as well. So those are the settlements that we've received since the last board meeting, past couple months in our regions. So it's good to see that we get some, in addition to holding hearings and working on appeals, some of which may go all the way up to the Supreme Court. we also do get swifter remedies for workers on a regular basis in our regions. And so our staff is working really hard to investigate the charges as they come in. And when there is a possibility of resolving a case more quickly rather than waiting the length of time it takes to do a full hearing, we do endeavor to settle those when we can get a good result for the workers and without all the time and expense and delay of litigation. So kudos to our regional office staff for all their fantastic work, and just, despite all the challenges we're facing with the pandemic, they're still out there resolving cases, investigating cases, and just providing the services that the ALRB is charged to do, and is our mission. So in addition to the casework, we are also, our office staff, regional office staff, is also conducting a lot of outreach. And as I've mentioned in prior meetings, we have 3 staff members who are solely dedicated to outreach and focused entirely on that mission. And that has really helped the ALRB get out there a lot more and be a lot more active in the communities that we serve in California, in the agricultural communities. So I'll just give you a few highlights of what we've been up to in the past couple of months. So our staff attended 9 in-person events where we distributed about 2,200 COVID-19 guides for farm workers, where they give farm workers information about their rights, workplace rights relating to COVID-19. And that also includes some wallet cards and new materials that we developed in collaboration with some of our labor agency and some other partners in UC Davis and others, and to create materials that are less text heavy, more accessible to farm workers regardless of literacy level or language spoken. So we want to open up our materials to like Indigenous farm workers, as well as those who speak Spanish and English. And we've also partnered with the Labor Commissioner, the California Labor Commissioner, and Cal OSHA, as well as local community-based organizations, to conduct outreach and a caravan to the agricultural fields to provide information to farm workers about rights relating to COVID-19, as well as the dangers of heat illness during this hot, dry summer. And so we participated in these events and caravans, both in Tulare County, as well as in the northern Santa Barbara County and San Luis Obispo County area. So the Tulare County events were in June, where we also, our ALRB Visalia staff, hosted a press conference in our office parking lot for all of those involved, and it was a very nice event. And then we had staff in Santa Maria and also the San Luis Obispo County area in July doing the same thing in collaboration with these other departments. So these events are a good example of the ALRB's increased collaborations with other government and community-based organizations that we've embarked on, really spearheaded by our outreach team, to provide more information and better information and referrals to farm workers. And we've also distributed a number of pamphlets and written materials through community-based organizations and at other events. We appeared in 2 Spanish language radio interviews in Sonoma County and Tulare County. And we conducted 6 Facebook Live events where we had our staff appear together with other organizations to give outreach on farm worker rights. And we found that to be a very effective means to reach more workers. So we have done such events with groups like the Mexican Consulate, TODEC Legal Center in the Imperial Coachella Valley, La Luz Center in Sonoma County, Central Coast United, Central Coast United for a Sustainable Economy in Ventura County, International Rescue Committee in the Bay Area. So just a variety of different organizations we partnered with for these presentations. We've also been we conducted 9 presentations, or trainings rather, to worker groups, community-based organizations, and agricultural employer groups during the past couple months. And we had a total of 103 trainees at these presentations. And so, yeah, like I said, we trained a number of different nonprofit community-based organizations, and we also did a 2-part training in both English and Spanish for supervisors and employers through AgSafe about employer obligations under the Agricultural Labor Relations Act and workers' rights. So we've been busy doing those types of presentations as well. And then finally, our regional office staff have continued to staff our helpline, ALRB's helpline, in which we take calls from farm workers and assist them in providing information about workplace-related issues, and connecting them with assistance through referrals. And the number of calls we've logged since we began this, or really opened up this line last fall for all workers and issues, the calls have increased steadily since we've opened the line. So I think the word is getting out about this resource, and especially with all the good outreach that the ALRB is conducting, and the collaborations with other government and nonprofit organizations. So again, I want to just say thank you to our regional office staff for all their fantastic work and for being out there and still getting information to our stakeholders despite the challenges of COVID-19. Really appreciate everybody's hard work and dedication. And that concludes my report. I'll answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Julie. Really appreciate that. And also want to double down on congratulating our outreach staff. We recently had an internal update, and I think in a 3-month span, they did over 60 different events, which was just really phenomenal. And it really speaks to the value of having these positions. And so thankful that we have this team and the great work that they're doing. Do any of my colleagues have any other comments or questions before we go on to the next item? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. Next, we have agenda item number 7, which is the Division of Administration Services report with Brian. Brian, take it away.
Good morning, Brian Doherty. I'm the Chief of the Administrative Services Division here at ALRB, and I just have a few brief updates, basically focusing on the fiscal side of the house. We successfully completed the year-end close that ended on June 30th of this fiscal year, and are currently working closely with the Department of General Services contracted fiscal unit to complete our year-end financial statements, which should be completed by the end of August. And at that point, I will have updated expenditure information to provide to the board that will cover the entire fiscal year 2021. The preliminary balance, it appears that we spent approximately 99% of our annual appropriation, excluding the one-time limited term funding that we received for our BCP outreach positions, which are set aside for a 3-year period. So we still have that funding remaining. The 99% expenditure rate is significantly higher than historical levels, which is good. It means we're ensuring that we're maximizing the use of the resources that are being provided to ALRB for state operations, and is mainly due to a higher filled position rate than what we've had historically at ALRB. So like I said, for the next report, I will have a full, complete expenditure report to provide for that fiscal year. We have also successfully implemented the start of the new fiscal year based on the budget that was approved by Governor Newsom. The appropriation for the ALRB for fiscal year 21-22 is $11.5 million. I'm also happy to announce that the statewide operating expense and equipment reduction that was proposed, a 5% reduction, which I think equated to about $204,000 for ALRB, was not included in the final budget that was adopted. So we will have our full operating expense and equipment budget to be able to expend in that fiscal year. So that's good news as well. In addition to that, we have the fiscal operating system and CalAiders is now online to allow the administration division to begin processing both travel work claims as well as processing purchase orders that were on hold until the new startup of the new fiscal year began, starting last week. So with that, that's all the updates I have for the Administrative Service Division, but happy to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you to you and your team. I am reminded every time I talk to you how grateful we are, how lucky we are to have you for keeping managing our budget so well and keeping us on track. And also to your team for really doing such tremendous work, particularly during the pandemic, which has had a lot of different twists and turns, as we all know. And while you are a small team, you manage to do a lot of work and are very good at it. So really appreciate it. Any other comments and or questions from my fellow board members? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. The next item is agenda item number 9, the legislative report, and that will be handled by our Chief Board Counsel, Todd Ratchin. Todd?
Yes, thank you. On legislative updates since the last meeting, Assembly Bill number 616 is currently in the Senate. On June 17th, it was amended and re-referred to Senate Appropriations, and on July 15th was ordered to a second reading in the Senate. So that is the current status of that bill. And I have a report providing some of the details on the bill that is available on the website.
Thank you. Thank you, Todd. Okay, next is agenda item number 10, the personnel report. There are no personnel items to report. So I'll move on to agenda item number 11, which is public comment. Please be advised that the board is unable to adjudicate, comment, or resolve any pending case matters before the board. I will ask our executive secretary, Santiago Avila Gomez, to go first through the queue and then open it up to others if they wish to comment. If you have technical difficulties or miss your turn, remember, we will work to come back to you, and please remember to be on mute unless you are speaking. If you require translation, please advise us. And is the interpreter able to share that information before we open it up for public comment? Okay.
She's complete.
Okay, perfect. All right, do we have anyone in the queue for public comment?
No one is waiting in the queue at this time of the opening.
Okay. All right. Well then, thank you so much for your reports. We were a little bit speedier than we anticipated. We do have an informational panel, but it's set to start at 11. So we are going to take a recess until 11 a.m. And then I hope members of the public will be able to come back for our informational panel on extreme heat and its impact on the agricultural industry and farm workers. We have a fabulous group of experts that are going to be sharing knowledge with us, and I think it'll be fascinating. So please take a break and come back here at 11, same Zoom link, and we will start the panel promptly at 11 a.m. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are back now for our panel. And thank you to Board Member Flores for reminding me that I did skip over the regulations report. I don't believe I skipped over the agenda item. We do not have a report this month. But I appreciate you mentioning that so we can provide that clarification. I'm thrilled to introduce our informational panel, which will give us an overview of extreme heat and the impact of heat on the agricultural industry and farm workers. In light of the increasing number of heat events as a result of climate change, we've seen the extreme heat event in the Pacific Northwest earlier this year, and just yesterday, a UN climate report that discussed climate change isn't off in the distance. It's happening, it's here, and we are certainly feeling its impact, particularly in the industry that we work in and around, and have workers very much on the front lines here in California and in other parts of the country that are dealing with these impacts today. I'd like to give a special thanks to the Governor's Office of Policy and Research, Nguyen Tara Key, who helped us get this panel together, as well as the Air Resources Board Chief of Staff, Jamie Callahan, formerly of the Governor's Office, who also helped get this together and was able to connect us with this wonderful group of panelists. With that, I am pleased to introduce our panel. I will list everyone and then I will turn it over to our first panelist. So joining us today will be Kathy Bauman-McLeod, Senior Vice President and Director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. Lauren Parker, a postdoctoral fellow and coordinator for the USDA California Climate Hub. Patrick Bearer, postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Food Security and the Environment at Stanford University. And then also Professor Mark Schenker, the founding director of the UC Davis Center for Ag Health and Safety and a distinguished professor emeritus from UC Davis. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. McLeod to help introduce us to this issue.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Kathy Bauman-McLeod, and I am the director of the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council. And I'm going to just go right in. You covered some of the top line events of right now that are showing us the importance of understanding this issue and the impact it's having. And we are finding that there are many gaps in the data sets for us to really understand these impacts, health, economic, infrastructure, in all dimensions. Heat is called the silent killer. There's a reason for that. NOAA shows it to be the #1 killer of climate-related hazards. Kills more people than any other, more than hurricanes, more than floods. And the 6th report of the IPCC that came out yesterday underscores that, with a predicted additional 1.5 degrees centigrade in warming. Several months back, the International Energy Agency put out their report that predicted the largest set of emissions in a decade for 2021. And so it's just getting hotter. And if we made no changes, we'd see these temperatures through 2050. And we have to act. There are solutions, and the people who had the least to contribute to this problem are bearing the brunt of it. And the inequity seen in the way that heat bears out is dramatic. And this invisible threat has no owner, it has no season, and it has no name. And so no owner, meaning there's no agency that's responsible for heat. We see that FEMA is responsible for flood. We see that the Forest Service is responsible for fire. You've got CAL FIRE in California, and we have other agencies over these hazards, and yet no specific owner of heat. It has no season. We have a season for fire. We have a season for hurricanes. We do not have a heat season, and it has no name. We name hurricanes, we name fires, we tacitly name heat waves. We have the Pacific Northwest Dome heat wave, but we also have things like the Labor Day heat wave, but we need a naming convention and a categorization for framework for naming these deadly events that are only growing in size and length and
Someone is
geographic.
here. Okay.
Next, I want to talk about solutions. I think there are lots of.
You're going to your launch chat at the one.
Pardon me, someone is, if someone could go on mute.
I think it might be Fatima. Her box is lighting up. So I think, oh, great. Okay, thank you. So in terms of what do we do about it? I want to talk about our organization for just a moment and the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. The Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council is an organization. We have 14 team members. We're a global organization. We have people around the US and people focused in and on the ground in Chennai, in Tamil Nadu in India, in Athens, Greece, a big presence in Miami, and our goal is to reach 1 billion people with resilient solutions to climate impacts, migration, and human security. And so we set that vision to reach 1 billion people and saw right away that heat was one of the places where, ironically, we've been talking about global warming for decades, but not focused on heat. And that is showing up when we try to assess its economic impacts and look at other health impacts, and the data doesn't exist. And many of you know, and from a study from University of California, Berkeley, that when somebody is admitted to the hospital, there is not a box that you check that says this person is suffering from heat. It's something else. It's renal failure, it's heart failure, and there's not a billing code for heat either. And so we have lots of mechanical places where heat shows up, but we are not able to understand it as such. And some of these fixes are really clear and simple, not easy perhaps, but simple. When we came together as a group of experts and cities and members of the insurance industry and expertise around disaster response and heat health and public health in early, that would be late 2019, fast forward to last August, and we launched the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. The vision is a world without death or loss of livelihood from heat. And we formed this group and found specifically 4 areas where we needed to fill gaps. And the number one issue, and this won't surprise you, if it's a silent killer, how do you solve a problem if it's silent? And it doesn't have the visual nature of a hurricane or a fire. It doesn't rip the roof off of your house. An aerial photo of a community that's been suffering from a heat wave looks virtually the same from one day to the next. So it's quiet, it doesn't have the drama, and it can be a shock and a stress. You know, climate is not the only driver. We have the urban heat island effect. We have the way that our buildings are built. We have places that are least prepared for these temperatures to be most affected by them. And a lot of, when you think about a hurricane, a wind speed is about the wind speed on, for the most part, the physical assets in our communities, but heat is about the human body and about our health. And so when we think about early warning systems and the concept of naming and ranking, categorizing heat waves, we have to think about the human body in relation to temperature and humidity and other things. And so we focused, if the issue is a silent killer, we have to educate decision makers linked to vulnerable people about these risks and what to do about them. So we have 4 working groups in the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. We are 40 plus city leaders and mayors, and as I said, the insurance industry and the Global Center for Climate for the Red Cross, the elected insurance commissioner of the state of California, Commissioner Ricardo Lara. And you may have seen recently his report released in the heat recommendations that naming and categorizing heat waves is one of the top recommendations. And I'd like to recognize the chair of that subgroup, Louis Bloomberg, who's on the call today, who is a colleague of mine working on these issues in California. So we have to educate decision makers. We need to understand the best evidence-based effective policies that communities can enact. We need to understand how much it costs to have a heat wave. What are the risks? Who's at risk? How big is the risk? We need risk quantification, and then we need risk products. We need risk transfer products that go with finance. How much does it cost to recover from a heat wave? How much would it cost to get everybody ready? Those are questions that we need to answer. And lastly, implementation. We need to take all the evidence-based interventions, nature-based interventions. Nature is one of the most cost-effective interventions. It is, you can see in some places a 45-degree difference from a place that's shady under a tree in an area with not a lot of impervious surface to what is oftentimes a low-income community that's covered in concrete with no trees whatsoever, with industrial sites around it. And nature can be one of the best ways to address this, and have multiple benefits of cleaning water and cleaning air and all that sort of stuff.
Data, yeah.
The implementation, so these 4 areas are working groups of ERA. We also have a very strong science advisory panel. And so we have scientists from all disciplines. We have climatologists, we have a medical doctor from the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard and the Sea Change Center. We have behavioral scientists. We have atmospheric scientists, and we've just added an atmospheric scientist and an economist from Greece. And Greece, as you see right now, grappling with temperatures and fires that are apocalyptic in nature, as you see some of the images coming out of Greece. And so that science panel advises these working groups, and I'm very pleased to say that Los Angeles County just joined ERA and will be coming into the working groups, and will be exchanging and investing in heat risk reduction and early warning systems and all that sort of stuff. We're very excited to be working with LA County. We're also working with the governor's office in providing some potential solutions around heat risk reduction in all of these categories, and more on that later. And then I want to mention that we have focused on the economics. Again, we don't have all the data sets that we need, but we do know and will be releasing in the next 2 weeks the economic impacts in 4 dimensions of the United States economy, and we'll be focusing on a few key states and a few key dimensions. But one of the big things that won't surprise you is that African American and Latino Americans are the most hit by heat in terms of their personal economics. So they stand to lose the most in these temperatures, given the work that they do and where they live. And I'll have more to share on that, but that won't surprise you a bit. And I want to say that this is the moment for us to act. You know, we know what to do. We have evidence-based policies. There's more research to do, but we have enough to act. We have, there's capital to be deployed to invest in heat risk informed infrastructure. And we've made recommendations and offered help from a large group of organizations working on heat to the president and to the Congress in the infrastructure bill. And we are prepared to bring the economics and the policy toolkits and our understanding of the need for better and more refined early warning systems. And we'll be bringing some of that to the COP in Glasgow. And on the subject of naming and ranking heat waves. We've spent a lot of time and will be investing even more in understanding the difference between naming hurricanes. And there, just by the way, there's no empirical evidence that naming hurricanes has been helpful. And that's really interesting. There's all of the anecdotal data, but we are going to seek to change that in terms of heat waves and understand the way people behave, and is a name and a category a trigger for changing your behavior to protect yourself and your family? Will you act, and why and how? And does that differ geographically? And then the categorization of heat waves is a separate scientific based decision tree. And we have, through our group of our science panel, we have a specific science panel on this matter led by Dr. Larry Kalkstein, who is a synoptic climatologist and meteorologist. And we are looking at how an air mass becomes, does it take a category? You know, how many categories
Vamos
do
a
we?
mirar como estamos nomás like doing arts and stuff, pero it,
Hi, Erica. Hi, oh, thank you. And so that naming piece is one side, and the, as I said, the defining whether the air mass meets the test for a category is another. And so we've proposed a methodology, and we'll be working in various places around the country and also in other countries in Greece and Spain to help advance creating categories. And the key thing is that the category is linked to the human body. It has to be linked to human health. And so there's a lot to be done, but we have enough to know that we want to protect workers now. And we have more data than we have had before. We have this new economic research coming out in the next couple of weeks. And we are prepared to bring all of that as quickly as possible into good policy adoption and to good interventions, and to attract the capital that's affordable for communities to invest in these things, in addition to understanding the risk aspects and quantifying that risk. We need to have access to risk modeling that we can afford for communities all over. And so in closing, we have what we need. People do not have to die from heat. We can prevent that, and we know how to do that. And we need to do that now. And I really appreciate the invitation to join you today, and look forward to the rest of the panel and to staying engaged to see how the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance can help California and California workers. Thank you very much. Oh, and I'm a Californian. I was born in California. I feel like that's important to say.
Even more so. Well, thank you so much. I think your work is absolutely fascinating and really so critical. And just want to commend you also on the vision that you have, because I think that really directly ties into our work and our role with protecting farm workers, since they are one of the occupations that is more likely than others in the workforce to die and be injured from heat. And just the way that you're changing the paradigm about how we think about this, how we talk about it, and really, it seems like common sense, like, yes, you should be able to check a box that says I'm suffering from heat. And it's kind of like, wow, we're in 2021 and we don't do that. So really, really cool. I'd love to open it up first to my colleagues to see if they have any questions or comments. Okay, any other members of the public that have any questions or comments for Ms. McLeod? Okay, I have one question, I guess, and you touched on such a broad topic, but since we do work within agriculture, do you have any members or experts of the Alliance that are focused on ag specifically, or working to address specific issues within agriculture?
We have a member who is a food security expert that touches on ag and supply chain for food. And so we don't have somebody specifically, and we would be very much interested in having that expertise. So we're looking at, one of the things that we're going to share is that the heat impact to corn and soy and wheat is immense, and corn is very sensitive to heat. And this is less about California and more about the Midwest. There is a California story in some of the analysis that we've done. But I'd love to follow up on that. Veronica, that'd be great.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think, for us, it's, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later in the panel, but there's both the impact to crops and how it's changing harvest times and planting and even, time of day. Nighttime agriculture is something that's been expanding here, which has different implications for workers in the industry. And yes, we are a crop focused, a fruit and vegetable focused agricultural area, and less on some of the commodities that you mentioned. But certainly it'll be fascinating to see, and I'll work to connect with you to see if there might be some people that we can connect you to.
Well, we did find the nighttime picking to protect the berries from, the sun softens them and makes them harder to pick, or even makes them too ripe. And so we came across 3 a.m. shifts, which is a new, as you said, I think you said a new paradigm, and I'll agree 100%. And there are all kinds of questions about location. There's a recent study that says 30% of Americans say they're going to be moving in the next year. If the operations of an organization move north to accommodate the crop because the crop can't grow there anymore, what happens to the workers? Can the workers move? All sorts of questions of livability. And so it's just, pardon the pun, ripe for this discussion and more research.
I always appreciate a good pun, but yes, there's a lot of intersectionality with all kinds of things. Nothing is kind of siloed off. Yeah. If any of my colleagues have any other questions, let me know. Okay, otherwise, I'd like to turn it over to Lauren Parker, who is a postdoctoral fellow and coordinator for the USDA Climate Hub, which is California Climate Hub, which is based out of UC Davis. Take it away, Lauren.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. And thanks to Kathy for a great setup there. One of the things that she mentioned was educating decision makers and the importance of that for addressing the issue of extreme heat or even increasing background temperatures. And part of that, in terms of a role that I might fill or my colleagues in my line of work, would be putting a finer point on what some of the physical and environmental changes will look like. And that can provide some context, I think, for all of the additional needs that Kathy mentioned. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So my name is Lauren Parker. I'm with the USDA California Climate Hub. I have a background in applied climatology with a focus on agricultural systems. My research interests are really in specialty crops, crop phenology, and the sort of geography of crop niche with climate change. I also serve as the California Climate Hub coordinator. Our hub is on the UC Davis campus at the John Muir Institute of the Environment. And for those of you who may not be familiar, the USDA's Climate Hub program was established in 2014 to support climate-informed decision-making for farmers, ranchers, and forest land managers. And to do so with regionally specific information and support. And so you can see in that map kind of the geographic distribution of where the hubs are across the country. And then central to our hub model is close partnership and collaboration with scientists and extension agents, both at other USDA agencies and at universities, as well as with national and regional nonprofits. So today I want to talk about what we've seen in California as far as observed climate changes over the past several decades and what we expect to see in the coming decades with an eye towards extreme heat events. And then I'll share very briefly at a really high level kind of what those changes might mean for agriculture. So climate, if we think of that very generally as the long-term average temperature and precipitation, and we take a look at those metrics over the past few decades, and we can sort of ask questions, what's the variability and what are the trends in those metrics over time? And so when we look at the observed data, for precipitation, we don't really see much of a trend over a number of the previous decades. And the graph that you see there on the left is of annual precipitation in King City in the Salinas Valley. And so you can see there's a lot of year-to-year variability. Some years are drier than average, some years are wetter than average. And this is just one location, but that's really a pattern that we see statewide. Temperature, on the other hand, it's shown a warming trend. So as an example, in the Sacramento Delta region that's highlighted in that green box there, the daytime temperatures, so the orange bar, have warmed about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit on average across the region over the last few decades. And nighttime temperatures have warmed more than 2 degrees. Now, of course, exactly how much temperature change you've seen depends on exactly where you are. You can see that there's some variability, across these broad geographic regions statewide. But then even within a given region, there can still be some variability, and the spread of those orange and green bars gives you a sense of what the range is of temperature change within a given region. And that can be controlled by local geography, land surface cover, any other sort of unique environmental conditions that might produce microclimates. Now, if we look to the future, which I think is, kind of what most people are interested in, right? We can expect to see essentially these trends continue. Our long-term average precipitation, our annual precipitation, we don't expect to see a big change there, but we do expect to see continued interannual variability, and in fact, increasing variability from year to year in terms of how much precipitation we get or don't get. So extreme dry years, if we kind of think back to an example of that recently, 2013, 2014, those kinds of years may be about twice as likely under future climate conditions, whereas we expect that extreme wet years like 2016, 2017, when you had statewide precipitation that was more than 50% greater than normal, those kinds of years we expect to be about 2.5 times as likely. So again, folks you may have heard of precipitation whiplash. This is a term that's kind of been used in the media and kicked off by some climate scientists in terms of how we might experience this interannual variability in our precipitation. For temperature, we expect both daytime maximum and nighttime minimum temperatures to increase maybe about 4 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take, depending again on your location, over the next few decades. And then when we look towards the end of the century, during the summer, you might see average daytime high temperatures as much as 7 degrees warmer by the end of the century. And so that means that places like Salinas might feel more like Chula Vista by the end of the century. So if you're, for those of us in the inland valleys, we might think, gosh, 77 degrees for a daytime high in the summer sounds pretty delightful. But if you're used to these, cooler coastal temperatures, that can be a bit shocking. I do want to focus, though, on extreme heat. So we have this background warming that's ongoing, has been for a number of decades, and we can expect that trend to continue. But beyond those average temperatures increasing, I think in terms of impact, the important thing beyond exploring sort of averages or normals is to explore changes in extremes. And so from a heat perspective, we do expect to see a big jump in extreme heat exposure. So for example, these graphs are from CalAdapt, which provides this sort of modeled climate information for locations across the state. As an example, in Davis, we may expect to go from, having 3 or 4 extreme heat days a year, or perhaps a heat wave is sort of a one-off event, to dealing with maybe 30 extreme heat days by the mid-century and more than 50 extreme heat days a year by the end of the century. And then for those multi-day heat waves, so though, these things pose additional management challenges, additional health concerns. In a place like Davis, we might go from, 1 a year to 4 heat waves a year by the mid-century, and then perhaps more than 8 heat waves a year by the end of the century. And I do want to note that these projections are for RCP 8.5. So that's representative concentration pathway 8.5. This is our sort of highest warming pathway. So kind of going back to one of the things that Kathy mentioned, right? This is what we may expect, particularly for those end of century numbers, if we don't act. So it's imperative, that we do make some efforts to turn the ship around. One other thing I just want to note briefly with respect to these projections. Now you're looking at this extreme heat days change, and these are days above 103 degrees Fahrenheit, or in the terms of heat waves, 4 consecutive days at or above 103.4. That temperature threshold varies by location. So somewhere on the coast, their extreme heat has a lower absolute threshold temperature because climatologically it's a cooler location. These temperatures that I'm using here to define extreme heat heat waves are the 98th percentile. So the tail of that high tail of the distribution of our heat. Another thing with extreme heat that I think is important to mention is the timing. So extreme heat days, nowadays we might expect them to occur kind of in our typical summer, right? Memorial Day to Labor Day, June through September is when we expect to see those extreme heat days. But under future climate conditions, we can expect those extreme heat days to start earlier, perhaps mid-May, by the mid-century, and then by the end of the century, again, under that high warming scenario, as early as April. I mean, can you imagine in Davis, 100 and some odd degree temperature in April? It's pretty mind-boggling. And then not only that, we're talking about them lasting well into the fall. And so you have this increase in frequency, a more protracted season, a more protracted seasonality, if you will, for these extreme heat events. And then they also get more intense. So whereas that threshold temperature might be, 103 degrees for Davis for, defining an extreme heat event, we can expect that 103 degrees might not be so extreme as we move further out into the future. And then one more thing I wanted to mention in terms of extreme heat is this heat idea of the heat index. And I think that this is particularly critical and meaningful for this group being focused on ag labor. So if we consider the heat index, which accounts for temperature and humidity, right? It's an important consideration for farm workers. And we look at the number of days with a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, we see that increases dramatically across the Central Valley and across the southern inland regions. We're increasing by around 30 to 40 days by the mid-century, and between 70 and 80 days perhaps by the end of the century. And so where you might have, say in the San Joaquin Valley, you might have 10, 15, maybe in a really hot year, 20 days a year, where you have this high heat index in today's climate. In just, 15, 20 years, you might be looking at 40 to 60 days with this heat index above 100 degrees. And so that's that many more days that you have to be concerned about farm labor or farm worker health, just in terms of their exposure to heat. So we have a few, just at a really high level. I kind of want to wrap it up with, what does this mean for ag? And I'll try to speak a little bit to where it ties in with labor specifically. So one of the things that we see with background warming specifically is a potential change in crop phenology. We might see earlier bloom time. We might see earlier planting. And warmer summers mean more growing degree days, which means faster development of your crops. So then you're bumping your harvest time up earlier into the year. And so this has implications for the timing of labor needs. We also expect to see increased evapotranspiration and greater water demand for our irrigated crops. Just off the top of my head, that to me says, well, what are the implications of that when you have water demand for your crops, especially if you're pulling groundwater? Well, what does that mean for those co-located agricultural communities who also rely on that groundwater for their water needs? There's an increased risk of drought that we expect to see in the future, both as a function of that interannual variability in precipitation, but also as a function of our increased temperatures. When we think about implications for farm workers and human health, dry soils are more susceptible to wind erosion. So then you have potential issues around air quality, as well as easier transport of soil-borne microbes like valley fever. We'll also see greater plant and animal stress as a function of extreme heat. And then, sort of more indirectly related to agricultural production or crop production, there are air quality issues from more frequent and potentially larger wildfires. And not only are we concerned, of course, about the particulate matter from burning forests, but I think more so about the potential for toxins in that air from inorganic, non-organic matter that's being burned. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to my other panelists to hear a bit more about what they have to share. I do want to just highlight our website there for the climate hubs. You're welcome to check us out. And if there are any sort of follow-ups for me particularly, you can reach me at Ellie Parker at UC Davis.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Really interesting. And as we move through this, helping to contextualize what this really means for the industry. I had a couple of questions, and I also, some of my colleagues may have some questions for you. I'm wondering if there's anything that the Climate Hub or USDA more broadly is encouraging in California to, like, what you're seeing in terms of like a best practice to help adapt or mitigate some of these challenges with heat, or innovations that you're seeing or you're helping try and lead the industry to take to help reduce some of these adverse outcomes or adverse effects.
Sure. So one of our ongoing projects at the moment, we hope to have wrapped up maybe in 6 months or so, is the development of a menu of adaptation strategies and approaches for California agriculture. And there are a number of approaches and on-the-ground practices that producers can enact that both provide resiliency in the immediate term and resiliency for these coming changes. Those might be soil amendments that increase your soil water holding capacity that can provide a little bit of a buffer around the increased water demands during extreme heat. There's a lot of work, well, I don't know about a lot of work, but there's work going on around shade nets, around sort of more infrastructure ways to protect crops from heat. And then certainly there are, irrigation is the primary means by which we deal with heat for crop production. And certainly anything that we can think of that might improve the capacity to irrigate and provide that cooling. Of course, that has to be balanced with water resource availability. And then that kind of takes you down the road of issues around groundwater availability. And in a future where we have more variability in our annual precipitation, what can we do on ag lands to mitigate that? Agricultural managed aquifer recharge is an area of growing research in terms of managing our water to help us manage for the heat.
Wow. Lot. There's so many things.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I'm glad you exist. And I hope and that you're working to help the industry. I think it's a really I think that's a really great pivot that the federal government's taken that I hope our ag industry locally and across the country takes advantage of. One question I had is there anything in California, any commodity that you're seeing sort of be more at the front lines of facing more rapid adverse effects from heat?
So because we have this Mediterranean climate and because we have this, massive water infrastructure, we've really, I think, been able to manage for heat historically. In terms of any particular agricultural commodity, some of the things that come to my mind, interestingly, are not commodities that suffer from extreme heat exposure specifically in summer, although they certainly do, but rather are impacted by some of these, or will be impacted in the near future by the more background warming and the warming that we are experiencing in other seasons like winter. So I'm thinking about, and this is, my bias because it's my, personal interest, but I'm thinking about high value perennials, things like walnuts that require a lot of chill accumulation and rest during winter. They may be a little bit more hardy to some of the heat waves. Although that said, there's some challenges with using things like irrigation to mitigate heat waves in walnut orchards. You run into issues like fungus and disease when you have too much water in the root system. But nonetheless, I think that there are a whole host of challenges for some of our high value perennial fruits and nuts. And then there are other things like vegetables. In terms of extreme heat, I think lettuce comes to mind. And some of the bolting temperatures and, the locations where we grow warm season lettuce versus cool season lettuce, and how might those shift with not only increasing background warming, but sort of the increase in these extreme events as well.
Wow, just really, it's fascinating stuff. I'd like to open it up for my colleagues. Do any of my fellow board members? I see Member Lightstone with a question.
Yeah, just following up on your question, Victoria. So have we seen any changes in patterns in planting or movement of crop patterns because of either the background or the extreme heat? Are we seeing any of that already? I guess is the question.
Sure. I think that, a colleague of mine, Tapan Padak, he's a extension specialist at UC Merced, focusing on agricultural climatology. He recently had a paper looking at the change in transplant date and harvest timing for processing tomatoes in the Central Valley. And yes, we do see some changes particularly for annual crops in terms of timing of planting and harvest. And I think that, you know, in terms of any given year, we could certainly say that there have been some shifts in harvest timing for our crops. I hesitate to give you a answer in terms of like longer term trends and what that might look like. Nothing is jumping to mind at the moment, but I can Google around for you and follow up later if you'd like.
Oh, thank you.
Board Member Broad.
I have a question about tree crops with freezing requirements. Because presumably hotter days mean hotter nights. Does that mean that a lot of California's tree crops simply are going to become impossible to grow here? It won't change the dates, it'll just be impossible.
So for some crops like walnuts, they have a really high requirement of the chilling accumulation. And I think that for those crops, we can expect down the road to see a sort of shrinking geographic area that meet those climatic requirements. For other crops like almonds, as an example, their chill requirements are pretty low and they're pretty well adapted to high temperatures. The question with crops like that then become, you know, water. Do you have enough water to support the production? So it really varies crop to crop. There's some efforts being undertaken to develop low chill varieties, both in California and in other parts of the country that, you know, grow similar crops. So peaches, as an example, the University of Georgia and University of Florida, it might be Florida State. They have a breeding program to develop low chill variety peaches. You know, that could be something that, you know, if it's not going on with California entities, certainly the California growers could benefit from. So there are efforts being undertaken to kind of mitigate those challenges where possible. But truth be told, I think that for some of our crops, you know, we will need to sort of think about transitioning away from a particular crop and to another crop that's more suited for that future climate.
Thank you.
Wow. Any of my other colleagues, Member Flores?
Yes, and so just to follow up, excuse me, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
To follow up on your last comment, is there an idea of what the transition would look like? So what types of crops would be best suited for what could potentially be our future season cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that I'm personally interested in. I think that I think it's a space that's pretty ripe for more research. There's a lot that goes into you know, where we grow certain kinds of crops. There's the climate niche, obviously, but there's also sort of these challenges of water application. There are soil considerations, and then some of the things that Kathy mentioned earlier, right? Like if you transition your crop, what does that mean for the transition of all of these sort of support production, you know, the support systems that go along with that, including labor, but also processing plants and, you know, distribution hubs and the whole like. So exactly what the future looks like there is a little hard to say. I don't think it's quite as simple as, you know, look and see what's growing south of you and just assume that that's going to move north. That's a little bit of a cop-out answer, I know, but hopefully it provides you a little food for thought.
Thank you. I'd like to also open it up to members of the public for a couple of minutes if they want to ask a question of Lauren. We'll have time at the end of our panel as well. But is there anyone in the comment queue or any other members of the public who'd like to ask any questions?
There's no one in the comment queue.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Lauren. This is fascinating. I would love to see your reading list on ag climatology for lay people sometime, because I think I could, we could talk about this all day. There's just so many different implications, but really appreciate you taking the time to do this presentation, and look forward to seeing more of your work. And I know you may have to go, so if you have to leave, no worries there, but just so appreciate you taking the time. Next, please join me in welcoming Patrick Bearer. I hope I said that correctly. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Food Security and Environment at Stanford University, and I think is going to help as we transition more to thinking about the macroeconomics and labor implications of heat in the ag industry. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the chance to talk to everyone today. I am Patrick Bearer. I'm an economist at the Center for Food Security and the Environment at Stanford. And I wanted to talk today about a paper that I and some co-authors had come out about 2 weeks ago now. It's been released as a working paper, an IZA working paper, and a Washington Center for Equitable Growth working paper. And what we do in that paper is look at the impact of temperature on workplace safety and labor market inequality. We focus in particular on the impact of heat on injuries. As Kathy pointed out in the first talk we heard today, heat is one of the largest sources of damages, particularly it's the single largest source of mortality damage from climate change. It kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. We know a lot less though about how heat impacts injuries, which could be particularly in a place like the United States where there is reasonably good adaptation to heat in the hotter places in the country. It is a huge problem in places like Seattle that haven't historically experienced heat. But in the hotter places of the country, California, parts of California certainly qualify. The impact of heat on injuries may actually be more significant than the impact of heat on mortality. And so we wanted to look at that, particularly when you're talking about workplace injuries, because there are so many workers around the world, but also in the United States, that are exposed to heat every day on the job. And there's a particularly strong gradient across the income and socioeconomic sort of distribution in who is being exposed to heat in the workplace. Low-income workers, minority workers are disproportionately exposed to heat in their day-to-day job, and we think are disproportionately exposed to injury risk as well. And so what we did is used injury claims from the universe of workers' compensation claims in California from 2000 to 2017. California is somewhat unique in that it mandates all workers in the state have workers' compensation. So it's somewhat unusual across the country in having that requirement. But this gives us a great deal of insight into when and where, and in particular on what day people are being injured at work. And that allows us to relate that to the temperature that they were experiencing at that workplace on that day to try and answer three questions. The first is the obvious: what is the relationship between temperature and workplace injuries? But then secondly, how does that relationship change across the income distribution? Our hypothesis is that low-income workers are going to be more impacted by this, but does that turn out to be true? And then the third is what role can policy play in facilitating adaptation and work protection? We're going to take advantage of the passage of the California Heat Injury Protection Standard, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that occurred in 2005, sort of right in the middle of our sample period, to look at how the relationship between temperature and workplace injury changes after the implementation of that law relative to the period prior to the implementation of the law. So I'm going to go through pretty quickly what we find at a fairly high level, and then I'm happy to answer more detailed questions about any of the parts of the paper that I talk about today. So what we find in general is that heat does increase workplace injuries. There's a pretty substantial effect. Days above 100 degrees increase workplace injuries somewhere between 5 and 15%, depending on how exactly you measure injuries. And the way we're gonna estimate that is, I'm showing you on the right-hand side, at a zip code level, the number of injuries in every single zip code in California over the course of our sample. And so the way that we're going to estimate the impact of heat on hot days, we're not going to rely on the fact that variation across the state in temperature. Obviously, the Central Valley, for example, is much hotter than, say, the Bay Area. So there's sort of natural variation across the state, but then that's also going to be pretty highly correlated with the type of work that's being done and who lives in which places. And so we don't want to sort of contaminate our estimates with that cross-sectional variation and changes in occupations. Instead, what we're going to do is rely on the day-to-day variation within a given zip code to estimate the impact of a hot day. So we're going to look at a zip code on one day when it's 70 degrees, and then we'll look at that same zip code on a day when it's 100 degrees, and we'll compare the change in injuries within the same zip code on that hotter day to that cooler day within the same zip code. And that gives us a plausible estimate of the impact of heat, separating out all of the other things that you might think are correlated with heat exposure, whether that's income or the type of work you're doing. We're really trying to compare like to like here, and we still find this very large impact, even pulling out all of the other things that might push in the same direction, say, workers' occupation, for example. I think one of the things that we found most interesting about our results, though, is obviously you think that hot days are going to increase heat-related injuries. So things like heat rash, heat syncope, heat stroke, things that are dehydration that are going to be directly related to going to work on a hot day. Those increase by pretty enormous margins on a day above 100 degrees as compared to a day in, say, 60 to 70 degrees, which is about the optimal temperature for outdoor work. But we also find non-heat related injuries increase pretty substantially as well. So somewhere between, like I said, 3% on cooler, hot, but relatively cool hot days versus 6 to 10% on really hot days. And the hypothesis or the explanation there is this idea that I think anyone who's worked outside on a really hot day understands that you get tired, you lose focus, it's harder to concentrate on what you're doing. And so if you're working in an environment that's already somewhat dangerous, you're working with large machinery, you're working with hazardous chemicals, or you're working up, particularly for construction workers, say you're working up on a roof or on scaffolding, that little bit of change in your concentration that occurs because of the heat, because you're a little bit more tired, results in a substantial increase in these kinds of accidents that we wouldn't think of as being related to heat, but the risk of that accident increases when you get tired and you lose your concentration. And what that actually means is that these kinds of injuries are a much bigger danger than the heat-related injuries. So there are huge percentage increases in heat-related injuries on hot days, but that's not actually driving the major increase in injuries. Rather, it's these kinds of injuries in falls, slips, getting crushed by machinery. The baseline rate of those injuries is so much higher that even the smaller percentage increases in those injuries result in much larger absolute change in injuries. And what that means is that we've really been underestimating the impact of heat-related injuries in California. So this statistic I have here, the 850 heat-related injuries per year, comes from the California Occupational Safety Division of Occupational Safety. And that's sort of the official estimate, looking at things like dehydration and heat stroke. Our estimates, when you include all of these other non-heat related injuries or injuries that aren't coded as heat related injuries, as Kathy said, there's really no box, unless it's heat stroke, for example, there's no box where you can check and say it's heat, but you still have a pretty strong and plausible relationship between the heat and your likelihood of injuring yourself. When you count all of those other ones, we end up with about 4,500 injuries. And so there's a substantial increase in the number of injuries that we believe are related and due to the heat compared to when you measure just things that are actually coded as being related to the heat. The other thing we look at, though, is how this varies across the income distribution. So just at baseline, low-income workers experience twice as many, actually slightly more than twice as many injuries as high-income workers. And that reflects the fact that occupations that are riskier, say construction, manufacturing, those occupations don't pay as well as things like finance or where you're working in an office. And so the baseline risk for low-income workers is just going to be higher than the baseline risk for high-income workers. Low-income workers also experience nearly twice as many hot days as high income workers in California. They disproportionately live in places like the Central Valley as compared to the Bay Area, for example. Finally, so just those two facts alone, even if the impact of a given hot day was the same for a high income and low income worker, those two facts alone would mean that low income workers are going to be more impacted by hot days and more impacted by injuries that occur on hot days. But we also find that the marginal effect of a hot day is about 40% larger for low income workers. And we believe that that relates to the fact that it's harder to adapt a low income, a low income worker is more likely to be working outside, for example, and it's harder to adapt that kind of outdoor environment to protect the workers from the heat than to adapt an indoor environment where you might be more likely to be working if you're a high income worker. And so taken together, these three facts suggest that low income workers are going to be substantially more impacted today by heat, but going forward as the climate warms are going to be substantially more impacted by climate change than higher income workers. And so there's an important distributional impact that I think a lot of the literature on climate change has tended to ignore. There's been an assumption that low income workers may be exposed to more heat, but the marginal impacts are the same. And it turns out that that really isn't true. And so we've been underestimating what we already think of as pretty large distributional consequences. And the last thing that we do is look at the California Heat Injury Protection Standard. I think many of the people on this call are probably familiar with it. It was a standard passed in 2005 and then formalized in 2006 that requires requires firms to protect their workers and do certain things to protect their workers from heat on a sliding scale, depending on what the temperature is. What I want to highlight, though, is that it's a pretty unique law in the United States. When it was passed, it was the only mandatory law. And as far as I know, California is still one of only 3 states that has a law requiring heat protections for workers. There is no federal standard, binding federal standard that requires firms to protect their workers from the heat. And so that law, as I said, it took effect in 2005. And so we're going to look at how our estimates change when we compare the period from prior to 2005 to post 2005. And what we find, you can see in this graph that the circles are the estimates using our data prior to the implementation of the law of the impact of heat on workplace injuries. And the diamonds, the darker blue diamonds, are the impact, the same estimates after the implementation of the law. And the movement from the circles to the diamonds closer to that solid line at 0 indicates that after the implementation of the law, workers' injury rates were far less sensitive to the heat than prior to the implementation of the law. It seems like this may have solved some negotiating problems between workers and firms in terms of the kinds of protections that firms were offering workers on hotter days. It doesn't appear to have had any negative impacts on wages. From an economic theory standpoint, you might expect that if workers got increased safety benefits, they might have seen decreases in their wages as a sort of offsetting effect. It doesn't appear that we don't see any evidence that happened, and we actually see small increases in employment after the implementation of the law, which suggests that this is on net an improvement for workers. There's an increase in safety and no really offsetting decrease in wages or employment. We can't show conclusively that this change that we document here in the sensitivity of heat is due to the law. We don't have the data, using only California data, to be able to do that. We're working now with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to get data on workplace injuries nationally, which will allow us to do some comparisons of the impact of this law in California over the time period, compared to how these things changed across the country as a whole over the same time period, which will allow us to hopefully pinpoint the impact of the law itself, rather than just show this, what is right now sort of correlation that the sensitivity of heat declines after the implementation of the law. And one thing I want to note too, I don't have it on the slides, but the total impact of the monetary impact of these injuries, when you add up all of the lost productivity, the lost wages, the hospital costs, the cost to the workers of actually being injured, the total impact of heat-related injuries in California every year is on the order of several $100 million. And so this is an area of, or a cost of climate change and a cost of heat in particular that we really haven't documented in the past. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in costs that have not been included in calculations of the damages of climate change. And so we think this is a really substantial source of damages from heat and from future climate change. Just like, as Kathy said, the impacts of heat on mortality are very large and tend to drive the estimates of damages. We think that when you add in the impacts of injuries, they can substantially increase those damage estimates as well. And just one final note, Lauren alluded to this at the end of her talk too, the impact of pollution and in particular wildfire smoke on workers. The lab that I'm affiliated with or was affiliated with at Stanford has done a lot of work on the impacts of wildfire risk and the impact of wildfire on pollution across the whole United States. And so one thing that we're hoping to do now is take some of our data on worker injuries and pair it with some of the work that has been done in this lab on areas that are exposed to wildfire smoke to get a better understanding of the impact that pollution, in addition to heat, that pollution is having on agricultural workers and outdoor workers in general. So I'll leave it there. This is the title of the paper, the IZA working paper, if you're interested in taking a look. And that's my email. I'm happy to answer questions now and also to answer follow-up questions via email.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating panel or fascinating presentation. I do have a couple of questions. I'm curious if you are seeing any distinctions in the data with in terms of the rate of injury for heat illness with outdoor professions that tend to be outdoors, such as low income versus, like, what comes to mind are peace officers who are generally speaking have better benefits and also are more highly compensated than maybe construction or ag or other outdoor workers. And I wonder if you're seeing a distinction there with rates of injury.
So we do a little bit of work to break down how these impacts vary across the specific industries that you might think of as being exposed to outdoor environments. So agriculture, construction, utilities workers. I don't think we've done that breakdown for like peace officers, for example. I know that construction workers are among the most impacted. And I think that of the outdoor occupations that we've looked at or industries individually, agriculture is next, and it's quite similar to construction. Those two seem to be driving a lot of the impacts that we see in outdoor occupations.
Yeah, one thing and it sounds like there's maybe not enough data for this, but I don't want to assume that. When I think of construction, it seems like there's a really vast kind of spread in terms of you have non-unionized firms that may be on the lower wage scale to unionized or other larger firms that predominantly work on like public works projects and get prevailing wage and generally have collective bargaining agreements that provide for greater benefits. And that would be another question, I think, within an industry to see if you're seeing distinctions there in terms of heat injury.
Right. One question we've really been interested in is this union question. Do we see less sensitivity to heat among occupations or industries or firms that have stronger union presence? We haven't been able to answer that yet. I think as you try and parse the data more and more finally, it becomes more difficult to answer some of these questions, but we're working on trying to divide we have industry codes, and now we're working on trying to assign occupation codes to each individual injury so we can get a better sense within those industries, which are the occupations that are most impacted. Because as you say, in addition to the gradient along sort of a union dimension, within construction especially, there's a huge variation in salaries among construction workers. So carpenters helpers, for example, I think the national average income for a carpenter's helper is somewhere between $25,000 and $30,000 a year, whereas you compare that to a unionized electrician who's making $90,000 or $100,000 a year. There's a big difference even within these exposed industries in salaries.
Yeah, definitely. Last other point, and then I want to open it up. One thing, again, this would probably be for future research, but I'd be really curious to see if there has been an impact in heat injuries for farm workers over the time period of the implementation of the new ag overtime law that went into effect, I believe, in 2017, just to see if, anecdotally, we understand that there has been a reduction in the number of workers working overtime as a result of that law because of cost implications, and wondering if that's resulting in any impacts on their heat injury or just general injury and illness rate.
That would be a really interesting question. I think I'd love to try and look at it. We need to talk to the Workers' Compensation Board to try and get data for post. I think our data only goes through the end of 2017, so we would need to update it maybe through the end of 2020 to try and get at that question.
Yeah, it's still working its way through. I think we're at 9.5 hours right now where the overtime rate kicks in, but fascinating to see maybe in a few years. I'd love to open it up for my colleagues as well. And Patrick, I don't know if you're able to stop sharing your screen. I'm having a little hard time.
Sure. I just wanted to make sure everyone could see the email, but there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Do any of my fellow board members have questions? Okay, and I see Julie, I think you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Just one question on, I think you mentioned that you're looking at data. Is it mainly from workers' comp filings? Is the data you're looking at to determine the rate of injury and illness,
yes,
both in California and nationally? Are there any other statistics you're looking at? And the reason I ask is just, I know that there's a severe level of underreporting of such incidents, especially among farm workers, a large percentage of whom are undocumented. Prior to coming to the ALRB, I used to represent farm workers in cases, and I had a number of people who were specifically told not to report it, to just go home and not say anything, or they'd be fired. And so I just know that there is a higher level in an industry like agriculture in particular, where you have a high level and percentage of undocumented workers. There's a high level of underreporting. So just wondering if there are any other stats or data that you're looking at.
Yeah.
So just hospitalizations or deaths in these rural areas.
Yeah. So for the California work, we've used the California worker compensation data. As I mentioned, we're now trying to work with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to take this nationally. And for that, we're using two different sources of data. One is the Survey of Occupational Injuries and Illness, and the other is the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries. And I think the survey data suffers from many of the same problems that you mentioned with workers' compensation. I think our sense is that the workers' compensation data that we have from California is the best available data on injury rates. It suffers from the least amount of underreporting, which isn't to say that there isn't underreporting, but OSHA data, for example, we know suffers from somewhere between 30 and 60% underreporting. And we think that the workers' compensation data, at least for agriculture, the workers' comp data might have a similar level of underreporting, but at least for other industries, we think it's a better approximation of the actual injury rate or number of injuries. For the BLS data, though, the survey data, Survey of Occupational Illness and Injuries, I think suffers from similar problems. But the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries, which gives us a slightly different object, it's the number of people who die on the job as opposed to who are just injured. Obviously, there's far fewer people who are killed at work every year. But that work or that data relies on more than just what the workers or firms report. I know that they also go through hospital records and go through, in particular, local coroners' reports to try and make sure that they're capturing all of the injuries. And so there is probably still underreporting there, but I think that's a better measure of the true number of fatalities as opposed to, say, workers' compensation or the survey.
That's good to hear that they're digging a little deeper than just the workers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Member Flores?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for this. It's just fascinating. I can't wait to read the paper. I have a question about the finding that low-income workers experience twice as more injuries than high-income workers. First, this kind of goes to the previous point I think that Victoria was trying to make. Does that hold true for workers within the same industry? Or do you have knowledge about that or any findings about that? And then the second question is, was there anything that you found that was directly related to why low-income workers experience more injuries? Is it the type of work that they're doing, the length of time that they're working during the day, access to management or supervisors, just generally speaking?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think we haven't looked rigorously at any of those questions. I can tell you what I think based off of the time that I spent looking at the data. So to answer your first question, I am not certain, but I have a pretty strong hypothesis or belief that that relationship would hold up within industries. So the number that I gave, the 2 times as many injuries for low-income workers as high-income workers, is across all industries and across all injuries in our data. But if you were to look at that within, say, agriculture or within construction, I am pretty confident that you would see the same trend. The magnitude might be slightly different and will likely vary by industry. But in general, the idea that low-income workers are substantially more exposed to injuries than high-income workers, I think, holds up even as you look within industries. In terms of why that's true, again, I haven't done a specific rigorous sort of examination of that, but I think it's mostly has to do with the type of work that you're doing. As I said, being a carpenter's helper, you're paid, say, $30,000 a year as opposed to an electrician. And just in general, you're doing riskier, more dangerous things as a carpenter's helper than you are as an electrician. There is some danger in being an electrician, but you're going to spend less time on ladders, less time on scaffolding, less time using heavy machinery. And so that, I think, in general, the use of survey data, other work that people have done sort of backs this up, that you tend to be more exposed to the elements, you tend to be more exposed to heavy machinery and dangerous equipment as you move down the income distribution, and also especially as you move down the education distribution. So if you look at workers who don't have a high school diploma compared to those who do, and then those who have a high school diploma but don't have a bachelor's degree compared to those who do, you see substantially more time spent outside, substantially more time exposed to extreme conditions and dangerous conditions among the lower educated workers than higher educated workers. One thing I should mention, I forgot, one thing that we found pretty interesting is that we see much stronger effects, much larger impacts for young workers than for old workers, and much larger effects for men than women, in addition to differences along the income gradient. And we think that might actually have particularly the impact for young workers rather than old workers might actually relate to this union question, that as you move up in a union, as you become older, you get more seniority, and you get the ability to choose sort of the plum positions or the safer, the less dangerous jobs. And so that may be why we're seeing fewer injuries among older as opposed to younger workers.
That is really interesting. I would have thought the opposite just based on
exactly our hypothesis. When you look at, say, for example, the impact of heat on mortality, you see much larger impacts on the elderly and the very young as compared to the middle-aged. But we see the opposite effect, that sort of workers between the ages of 25 and 35 suffer more injuries than workers over the age of 50, for example.
Wow. Member Lightstone, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, just thank you so much. Very interesting stuff. The only thing I was going to say is that in terms of, I know it's hard to get this data, but to the degree you can do within industry comparisons, particularly on the national level, it'll be easier in construction, but you've got, even in the construction world, laborers in public works projects or Davis-Bacon projects get paid much higher than laborers in non-public works, non-Davis-Bacon projects. So you could probably, do some get some data on union versus non-union in construction, and maybe even if someone targeted it, you know, in California in agriculture. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're hopeful, because when we move to a national scale, we just get so many more workers. And so we're hopeful that we'll be able to make some of those within industry comparisons in that data.
Any other questions for my colleagues? Okay, and Santiago, is there anyone in the public comment queue?
There is one person with their hand raised, Galaxy Note 8. If you'd like to make a comment, please go ahead. And I'll give the interpreter a moment to translate in case we have a Spanish speaker. The interpreter has finished her interpretation. I am waiting to hear from Galaxy Note 8.
Okay, I don't know if, is that person
No
available?
response.
Okay, I see Lauren, you've raised your hand in the chat. So do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I was really taken by the comment that, or the finding that the total monetary impact of heat injuries is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'm thinking about how, you know, economics is often something that sort of spurs action when we think about like observed costs or projected future costs. And I'm curious if there's any work being done or planned where you're sort of projecting out these monetary impacts of heat related injuries, given climate projections, and maybe even accounting for sort of different policy pathways that could be enacted to you know, limit those injuries, as we've seen with the California policy.
Yep. So we've done some work taking the RCP scenarios and looking at what those mean for changes in the number of days in each of our temperature bins. So over 80, over 90, over 100. What that means for those days in California, and then trying to think about what that means in terms of how many more injuries we think might occur in the future as compared to today. We haven't included any of that in the paper because, as you say, there's a lot of different paths that policy could take. And we want to take seriously the idea that there will be some responses, there will be future responses similar to the heat illness protection standard, for example. California is currently debating expanding that standard to indoor workers, which we actually find, I didn't mention it because I think it's less relevant to this audience, but we actually find pretty large impacts for indoor manufacturing workers, for example, because a lot of them work in non-climate controlled environments. And so as you sort of take those different policy actions, what we estimate based off historic data in a past policy environment may not be as applicable to the future policy or the future environment. And so we've been trying to think about how to account for those different policy paths as we project our damage estimates forward based off of the climate projections. The climate projections are pretty easy to come by. It's working out how those different policy paths or policy options will impact our estimates in the future that we've struggled with. I will say that it's not clear. You can think of a world in which we do a lot of adaptation, we're pretty proactive, and this relationship continues to get mitigated in the way that we've sort of seen in the data that we have so far. But you can also think of a world in which the climate warms faster than we're able to respond or take mitigating action. And so it's not totally obvious whether the impacts are going to go up or go down in the future. It's going to be sort of a race between our ability to mitigate and how quickly the climate warms. And I think teasing those two things apart is a really complicated question that we're struggling with at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patrick. And if you can stick around, great, but I understand if you're pressed for time. I do want to get to our next presenter, who is I'm excited to hear his perspective. As Kathy mentioned at the opening, heat has an incredible effect on the body, and particularly on farm workers who, as we've heard multiple times today, are really facing some of the most adverse impacts from a warming climate and from dealing with heat on the job. With that, I'd like to welcome Professor Mark Schenker. He's Distinguished Professor Emeritus from UC Davis and the founder of the UC Davis Center for Ag Health and Safety, which is just an invaluable resource, both for us and so many here in California and really across the country. And so, Professor Schenker, take it away.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all the preceding speakers who've really set the stage and presented fascinating data on this whole question. I'm going to focus on the human health effects and mostly on my own research because it's based in California and is the most relevant to our discussion. I want to start by just reminding people that heat-related illness is a spectrum of effects, from the minor heat rash to heat syncope, cramps, exhaustion, heat stroke, and so on. Now, the further up you go on this risk pattern, the greater the consequences. And when you have heat stroke, there's about a 50% mortality rate, even with treatment. So we're talking about something that is progressive and serious, and that's the topic. Now, we just heard about the classic heat-related illness risk factors, and these have been studied and their consequences, and age, infants, and the elderly being most at risk, social isolation, lack of air conditioning, housing characteristics. But this is not the pattern for the workplace, where we see a different picture. And this event has been mentioned in 2005 in California after a heat episode and several deaths. The governor said, we'll do everything we can to prevent this from happening again, and implemented emergency occupational regulations for heat illness, which became permanent in 2006. And as also has been mentioned, California has been a leader in this regard. We had the first heat standard and still are only one of 3 states with a heat standard. And I have to give credit to our state in taking the lead in this. We're not perfect, but we certainly are ahead of the pack. Now, the next year in 2006, the state investigated 46 cases of heat-related illness, and this gives us an insight in some of the issues. Clearly, the average temperature was elevated and core body temperatures were elevated, but almost all of the workers had available water and 78% had brake shade. So those were not critical. But look at this, 80% had been on the job for less than 4 days. Acclimatization was absent in the vast majority of these cases. And the other important observation was in the bottom here, where you see that 54% were doing strenuous work and another 20% moderately strenuous work. So lack of acclimatization and work strenuousness were both identified early on in this California curve of attention to this issue. Well, we implemented the emergency and the regular standard, and in 2008, there were several deaths again, illustrating that we weren't at the end of the line yet. And I put this up to show you a couple factors. One is that this was not the pattern that I showed you for overall heat stress. These were working age people, as young as 17 and as old as 64, and it was men and women. So it's a very different pattern from the typical occupational illness and from the ambient impacts of heat stress. That is, it's affecting men and women and working ages. Well, in 2008, the CDC did an analysis of occupational heat exposure deaths. And there are a couple of important points from this study. the rate of agricultural worker deaths from heat was 20 times the all industry rate. The vast majority were in crop production, and most or all of the cases where they had a place of death showed that there was an immigrant worker. And the ones that didn't have a place of death, we probably can assume the majority were also immigrants. So this is important in this question of agricultural worker risk versus other workers. Construction is close behind agricultural workers, both outdoor occupations. Now, there's some other interesting findings from this study, and I'll just show a couple. One is shown here. This is the rate of fatalities in North Carolina being almost 5 times the rate in California. And they don't have a heat regulation. They don't have the same attention to this in North Carolina. And this is the consequences. And the other interesting finding was that the rate when they looked over 5-year intervals was increasing for heat-related fatalities. And if we continue this out past 2006, we see that this has continued to increase with the climate change that we know and are all aware is occurring. So this is an increasing problem. We haven't addressed it seriously enough. And these are the data in terms of occupational fatalities. Well, let me just talk a little bit about the factors that affect heat in a human who's out work. First of all, we have the factors increasing heat. And the most important, of course, is air temperature, but humidity and solar radiation are important, and other factors of less importance. And then there are cooling factors, radiation from the body, convection, evaporation up to a temperature, up to a certain limit, sweating and respiration can cool the body. But the factor I want to focus on is this one, metabolic heat. And as you saw in that analysis by the state, metabolic heat is a serious risk for heat illness in workers. It contributes 40 to 50% of the body's heat, that is the heat generated by metabolic work. And it's the one factor that we have the most control over, that is reducing workload can reduce metabolic heat and heat gain. Now, this is another important curve from a lot of research showing productivity loss with increasing heat. And you see that after about, this would translate to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, there's a dramatic increase in loss of productivity. And I think this has not been mentioned and it's important to recognize. And also the risk of heat illness goes up in the same shape of the curve. Well, we were very interested in this at the Western Center for Ag Health and Safety, and we undertook the California Heat Illness Prevention Study, a multi-year study with a lot of components, of which I'm going to mention a few. I want to show you, though, that the locations were throughout the state, and there were 30 farms on 2 years that we measured heat gain and risk factors in over 500 farm workers. First, we did a lot of surveys and focus groups to understand the reality of workers in California. And there are just a lot of fascinating findings from this. 48% said they had ever experienced heat-related illnesses in work, and the mean was 5 times over their career. So this is not a rare event. And again, this issue, over almost 60% were unacclimatized when they last had heat illness symptoms. And then shockingly, 42% said they just continued to work regardless of the symptoms. So we start to see the complexity of this from a survey perspective in terms of the reality of what's affecting risk and what they do about it. Now, this is also some fascinating data from our survey. 72% said they were thirsty to extremely thirsty when doing agricultural work. Do you think you drink enough? 97% thought they drank enough. So we have a problem here in communicating risk and the reaction to it in these workers. And then, perhaps the most shocking to me, level of concern about heat-related illness at work. 90% said they were not at all concerned or only a little concerned. So the translation of this risk to the workers is not happening based on our data. And then we have this phenomenon. This is from focus groups and key informed intervals, and it's an article that we wrote, which is titled, "We Just Have to Continue Working, Farm Worker Self-Care and Heat-Related Illness." And it's the reality of farm work for our California farm workers, many of whom are undocumented, and they just have to continue working, even when the conditions should be saying that they should stop or rest. And I won't get into the complexity of this, but I put it up there to remind us of this reality. Well, we did a lot of physiologic field studies as well. And these were quite intensive. They were over a work shift where we measured hydration of the worker, work rate using accelerometers, measured clothing and by assessment. And then they swallowed a pill like you see here, which gives core body temperature over the work shift, and followed by questionnaire data before and after the shift. So a lot of physiologic measurements, taking a lot of data crunching to get clean data that can be used. This had to, of course, begin before the work shift, which was sometimes 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and I had a fabulous crew who were out there doing this. And I also have to give credit to the farmers who allowed us onto their fields to do this study. And cutting to the chase, we first looked at risk factors for dehydration, or a loss of 1.5% or more of body weight from pre-shift weight. And what was the bottom line on this? Well, high work rate was the most significant factor. That is, the metabolic heat generated by work, we found in this multifactorial logistic regression, was most significant. Interestingly, hydration knowledge was also significant in an inverse way. The more knowledge, the more risk of dehydration. Piece rate in this multivariate logistic regression also tended to be borderline significant after measuring work rate. And the female sex turned out to be less at risk of dehydration. And then we looked at elevated core body temperature. That is a temperature that went over 38.5 degrees centigrade, the normal being 37. Of course, this is not heat stroke, but this is pointing in the wrong direction. And here, once again, high work rate was the most significant risk factor. So coming back to my earlier comments, metabolic heat in our studies is the most significant risk factor for increased body temperature and risk of heat stress and heat stroke. Shift length was also significant, as was ambient temperature, wet bulb globe temperature. Dehydration, interestingly, was not an independent risk factor, and female sex, again, was a decreased risk. So what do we know? Well, heat-related illness remains a risk of illness and death, especially for the most vulnerable outdoor workers. The data are very clear that climate change factors have and will continue to increase risks of heat illness in agricultural workers. Risk factors for heat-related illness are multifactorial and require diverse approaches addressing heat gain and cooling. But we need to focus on these two factors in particular, metabolic heat gain and lack of acclimatization, which both turn out to be significant risk factors for heat-related illness. We were not able to look at acclimatization in our data, but I've tried to show you that that's clearly significant in all the data that have been able to look at it in agricultural workers. Now, the approaches are complex and they should include education. We saw the lack of risk perception for heat illness in farm workers, engineering solutions, so increasing shade, and enforcement, that is making the farms protect the workers when it's needed. Now, these approaches need to address cultural beliefs and perceptions, which I didn't get into, but they need to be implemented, and it's not straightforward. And, I would come back to the metabolic heat gain. At some temperature, when it's 110 degrees, 114 degrees, the appropriate workload is 0. And yet we don't have that protection in the standard. And it's so easy to do in agriculture as it might be in a factory where you could shut down the work. And then finally, heat-related illness is 100% preventable. I had a great crew of investigators and field workers who were out there collecting these data. As I emphasize, this is California relevant, and the conditions are worse in other parts of the country. But it shows that California, while we have made advances, and as was just mentioned, have reduced injuries with our standard, we're not there yet, and we have a ways to go. So thank you very much, and I'm glad to take questions on this topic.
Thank you so much, Professor Schenker. This was really interesting. I had a couple of questions, and then I certainly want to open it up to my colleagues too. When you talked about kind of the range of health impacts, it seemed, kind of by my layperson's mind, to have two extremes. So you had a series of what I'll categorize as like short-term impacts, like, heat rash, heat exhaustion from an event, to obviously organ failure and death, which I would believe would be interlinked. I'm wondering if there's any research on how like one acute heat event could kind of have a more mid to long-term health impact.
Well, that's a fascinating question. I didn't present our data on acute kidney injury. We measured acute kidney injury in our workers, and we show that it was significant in about 12%. That is a significant rise in the creatinine and reduction in kidney function. Now, acute kidney injury resolves, but what if you have it repeatedly? And as some of you may be aware, in other parts of the world, we have this chronic kidney disease of unknown origin, which is an epidemic of kidney failure, and the heat is thought to be the main risk factor for that. So it's possible that there is kidney injury going on, and we haven't looked at it, but that would be one example. The other thing that comes to mind is the productivity loss, and that repeatedly could be a consequence.
Interesting. I probably, like a lot of people, where you sort of look for shortcut, maybe most bang for your buck choices you can make. In terms of acclimatization, is there kind of a significant step, or again, sort of the most, like, this is the biggest input in terms of how anyone or farm workers specifically can acclimatize maybe more readily or more quickly?
I thought you were going to say, what's the prescribed course for acclimatization? And the variability is anywhere from 4 or 7 days to 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Acclimatization is the body adjusting to increased temperature, where it excretes less solutes and preserves vital organ function. And I don't know the answer to if there is a way to accelerate that or not. It'd be an interesting question if it could be done.
Yeah, good food for thought. And then my last question before I open up to my colleagues, How, you mentioned when you did the physiological survey, how you had workers swallow a pill for, can you break that down a little bit? I didn't quite understand how that worked or what that pill did, I guess.
It's a pill the size of a large vitamin pill. And it's swallowed to give, and there it has a little transmitter. And there's a receiver that is worn on the belt that is getting the minute by minute core body temperature. And you can imagine how hard it is to get core temperature. You can't put a, ear probe in or a rectal probe, or, I mean, this is the most accurate way to get core body temperature. And, this is the largest study that's used these. Of course, they're not useful for practical purposes. It's a research tool, but they were well accepted, and they're just cleansed away with the stools.
Gotcha. That was going to be my next question. I imagine they pass after a day or two. Okay. Do any of my colleagues have any other questions? Member Lightstone?
Yeah, sorry, I just have to unmute there. No, in terms of the metabolic, thank you so much for your presentation. It's very, very thoughtful and useful, I think. In terms of the metabolic heat rate, you have as separate variables, the high work rate and the piece rate. And in my mind, those are pretty intertwined. People work hard because they're paid based on the productivity in the piece rate system. And is there a way to, are those separated out, or are they pretty much intertwined? I guess that's the question.
Well, they're clearly correlated. And what came up first in the logistic regression was metabolic workload. So even after we did that, piece rate, came into the model, but it wasn't as significant. So, what I can tell you is the core driver is metabolic work rate, but that piece rate is a facilitator of that, and it stays in the model even after you put in account for a work rate.
Thanks.
Do any of my other fellow board members have any questions or comments? Okay, I'd like to open it up to others, either other staff or members of the public. Any other questions or comments for Professor Schenker?
Yes, we have 2 members of our staff and 1 member of the public.
Okay, Santiago, can you call them in order, please?
Sure. Manuela, who had a comment in chat. I'll give the interpreter a moment to interpret and allow Manuela to provide her public comment.
Hola, ¿sí me escuchan?
Sí.
Sí, sí la escuchamos.
Hola, buenas tardes. ¿Me escuchan? Hello?
Sí, escucho.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Oh, perdón. Ok. Pues mi comentario era para lo anterior, porque creo que es muy importante que sepamos más de estos peligros sobre el calor como organizaciones, como grupos comunitarios o como activistas en el campo, para poder educar a nuestros campesinos y también a los rancheros de cómo enfrentar estas situaciones, porque es triste mirar que cada año son más las muertes sobre estos problemas y que tampoco se sepan de lo que está pasando. Yo estoy aquí en el Valle de Coachella. Aquí han pasado ciertas muertes, pero no se escuchan en la radio, no se escuchan las noticias, no se sabe de esto que está pasando en los campos, y eso me alerta a mí y me preocupa, porque así es como querer esconder lo que está pasando en los campos con nuestros campesinos para, no sé cuál sea la razón, pero no hay mucha información sobre esto. Y esto me preocupa mucho porque yo estoy aquí en el del Valle de Coachella y me doy cuenta con lo que está pasando ahorita con los peligros del calor. Hay muchos casos reportados sobre el calor. Se sabe que muchos campesinos no tienen miedo de reportar estos incidentes en su trabajo por miedo, por muchos miedos a que lo despidan, a las represalias, a lo mejor porque no tienen papeles o no tienen un estatuto migratorio o porque están trabajando con otro nombre, por X razones. Pero es bien importante que nosotros nos alertemos sobre esto porque son vidas humanas que se están perdiendo. Nosotros tenemos que estar al pendiente de cómo seguir educando a nuestros campesinos para que ellos sepan cómo enfrentar estas situaciones o cómo responder en sí mismos. Ya si el supervisor o el ranchero o el mayordomo no responde, que porque a él no le interesa la vida ajena o porque a la persona que se está quejando piensan que a lo mejor está jugando o que a lo mejor son pretextos de no seguir trabajando o flojera, porque eso es lo que yo he escuchado últimamente en el campo. Nosotros estamos educando ahorita sobre los peligros del calor, yendo a los campos a hablar con los campesinos, llevando a un doctor o a un profesional que les alerte a ellos sobre estos peligros. Y estamos escuchando todas estas historias de cosas que están pasando, de que los rancheros no están poniendo mucha atención o contratistas, de que los regañan porque se salen, porque se sentaron, porque se sintieron mal y quieren que sigan trabajando. Y estos campesinos siguen trabajando por miedo a que los corran o por miedo a muchas otras razones. Creo importante que tenemos que seguir luchando para que se hagan más regulaciones y información más explícita para los campesinos, para que ellos entiendan exactamente lo que es el peligro del calor y que inclusive pueden morir. Eso se me hace muy importante, no nomás a los campesinos, sino también a los rancheros y a los supervisores, a los contratistas, a todo mundo, estarlos educando de todos estos peligros y cómo pueden ellos responder ante esto y que no hagan caso omiso a ciertos signos que los campesinos están dando y no les están haciendo caso. Gracias.
Thank you. For our interpreter, if you could please, if all commenters can make sure to try and slow down. We want to make sure we get your full comment into the record. I don't know if we're able to do that. If the interpreter could provide an English translation as best they're able to, that would be great.
Oh, should I respond or we're going to get the interpreter or?
I think let's wait for the interpreter. And for the interpreter, I don't know if you're on the English channel. We're not able to hear you if you are translating, or I'm not. And Santiago, I don't know if you're able to assist.
I'm trying to send messages to the system. I will try and get the interpreter onto our channel here.
Okay, let's just give it one moment.
If we don't have the interpreter, I can respond.
Let's just wait for Santiago just to chime in here, and then it may take that on.
Yeah, I don't have a response as of now.
Okay. We will go, Professor Schenker, if you don't mind maybe summarizing the substance of her comment. I was able to hear, at least for myself, I was able to understand some of it, but not maybe some of the key points, and then would love to hear your response as well.
Well, I'm in the same category. I got some parts of it, and the issue. Yes. Correct.
think we're experiencing some technical difficulties. I don't know if anyone else is able to hear or see the video.
I'm not here, but I do have limited capacity just because we have a non-Zoom WebKit, but I do see some members nodding. So I think depending on what channel you're on, some are able to hear. And it looks like it seems like Professor Schenker is able to hear, but I'm not positive. Okay, he's nodding yes.
Okay, so I haven't had a response from the interpreter. Would you like to move on to our 2 staff members that have public comment?
Let's see, before we do that, Professor Schenker, do you have any other comment or response to that last comment? And I understand if you're not able to just because of the technical difficulties.
Yeah, let me make a couple comments. This is a challenging issue. And I think the solutions, as I tried to emphasize, need to be multifactorial. It's not just educating workers. That's not enough in many cases. You know, we have this issue of the risk factor going up in some temperatures and then having heavy workload exacerbating that risk. And so the solutions need to be complex as well, multifactorial. Now, the whole other part of this story is the vulnerability of these workers. And this is a precarious workforce, as I like to characterize them, who are at risk, the majority of California farm workers are undocumented. And as we've heard in other presentations, they're not going to complain. They're not going to stop working. They're going to take risks because their job is often on the line. And, you know, that is an issue that needs to be grappled with. And I would just end by saying the OSHA standard says a healthy and safe workplace for all workers, not just documented workers or citizens or native born or what have you. We're protecting all workers in the workplace, and that needs to be the goal in this. So I'll just end it with that, but
Thank you. Can we go to the next person in the comment queue, Santiago?
Yeah, that would be, sorry, I lost track here. We've got one of our staff members, and it disappeared on me, Melissa Granda.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I'm an attorney with the GCE program, and I want to thank all of the panelists. Really important information, really scary information also. And I just want to make a comment, I think, along the lines of what Manuela was saying, also what Professor Schenker was saying. And that is that it's, well, first of all, let me step back and say that in the GC program, I do a lot of work talking to workers, very involved investigations. I'm also working on some Cal OSHA cases, helping them with a backlog of their cases that need to go to hearing. And so I'm learning more about heat. Some of my cases involve heat violations. And I'm understanding with this panel and with these cases that there's so much to learn about the gravity of the problem, as Manuela was expressing, and the solutions, the measures, the precautions. And I think that from my sense from talking to workers and inspectors is that there's a real lack of understanding, starting with the workers, but that tells me that the employers are not following the regulation to provide the training. And so I'm seeing this as an opportunity as an ALRB attorney who talks to workers as part of my investigations. This is an opportunity to be issue spotting and seeing where potential violations of the Cal OSHA regulations are happening, you know, because workers don't know about, for example, how much water they should be drinking under heat conditions. And so understanding that this means that they might not be getting the training, that they might not have the heat illness prevention plan in place. And an important part of our role as in the ALRB is issue spotting and then understanding how to make the proper referral and help to get workers where they need to go, and to help them understand that this too could be a violation. And so I want to invite my colleagues to learn more about everything we've been talking about today, as far as the problems with heat illness and what are the precautions and what are the laws, and to become more savvy at getting workers to the right place to address heat illness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you for your work. Santiago, can we go to the next commenter?
Hi. Thank you, Professor Schenker, for this presentation. It was really helpful, useful to understand exactly how we bring down all these problems to the worker directly in terms of how it affects people. So it's really important, and thank you for that. But I was wondering if you could clarify, because I don't know if this dovetails with board member, I think Lightstone's remarks about the metabolic rate and piecework rate. But I was just wondering, in terms of measuring work intensity, did you all make any kind of distinction between the type of activity, like say heavy lifting versus, picking in a row, like, aerobic versus anaerobic activity? Like, I'm just trying to understand more how you all measure the work intensity, because, you had mentioned in one of your last examples that, in a factory, you can shut down the production, right? Whereas in agriculture, if it's a continuous operation, it's harder to do that, or to take the break or whatever it is. So yeah, I was just trying to understand better how the nature of the work is reflected in that work intensity rate. Thank you.
Sure. When we started the study, we were measuring heart rate as a measure of workload, and we found the data were all over the map. It was too hard to clean the data and have a clear signal of workload. And so we switched to accelerometers, and accelerometers measure workload, but they have their limitations. They don't measure arm movement, for example. So if you have a job that has a lot of lifting of the arm, you may not capture that with the accelerometer. But even with the limitations, the accelerometer data clearly showed that that was the most significant risk factor for increased core body temperature. And so it was an imperfect measure, but it showed that, in fact, workload was driving the risk of core body temperature in our workers. Does that answer your question? Great.
Great. And with that, we are just past 1 o'clock, and so we will be winding down public comment. I want to say, Professor Schenker, thank you so much. And I just have to reiterate 2 key points I just want to share. One, the UC Davis's Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, I think, is really universally regarded by both workers' rights groups and employers in the industry, which I think just is a testament to the quality of the work and the vitalness of the information that the center provides. And so just really want to congratulate you on that, and also just reiterate my gratitude that we have this resource here. I know we've benefited from it as a state board, and I know I just hear all the time about so many private and public sector entities that really value the work that the center does. So just want to commend you on that, and thank you for this really amazing presentation. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their expertise. This was an amazing panel. We'd love to have you back. If you have other information to share with us, please do. And it was just so incredible. So thank you so much. With that will conclude our panel. I do, before we adjourn, want to share announcements. The next scheduled public board meeting is Tuesday, October 12th. And Acting Chair Lightstone will be taking the helm for that one. And with that, this meeting is adjourned and the record is closed. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.